Canelo Alvarez.
He's the face of boxing, the biggest pay-per-view draw on the planet, a national symbol in Mexico, a business mogul outside the ring, and arguably the most recognizable athlete in combat sports today. But in the summer of 2025, Canelo Alvarez's name started showing up next to a very different kind of headline. Not a fight announcement, not a record-breaking purse. Reports surfaced linking one of his business associates to alleged money laundering for one of the most violent cartels in Mexico. And almost overnight, the comment sections filled up with the same question, over and over. Is this just guilt by association, or is there something bigger going on here that the headlines haven't fully explained yet? I want to be upfront about something before we go any further. Canelo Alvarez has not been accused of any crime. He has not been charged with anything. What we're talking about today are public reports involving people in his business orbit and the questions those reports raised online. But the internet doesn't always wait for confirmation before it starts connecting dots. And once people started digging, they didn't stop at the business associate. They went back years, all the way to 2018, to a story Canelo himself revealed about his own brother being kidnapped right before one of the biggest fights of his career. And once that story got pulled back into the conversation, the speculation only got louder. So today, we're going to lay all of it out, in order, exactly how it happened. Where Canelo came from, how he became the most powerful figure in boxing, how his business empire grew far beyond the ring, what was actually reported about his associate, what that kidnapping story really was, and why so many people online keep trying to connect threads that may or may not actually lead anywhere. By the end of this, you'll understand not just what was reported, but why stories like this spread the way they do, and why boxing in particular seems to keep ending up in this conversation. Let's get into it. But before we get into the controversy itself, I need you to understand who Canelo actually is, and how he got to a position where this kind of scrutiny was almost inevitable. Saul Alvarez was born in Guadalajara, Jalisco, in 1990, the youngest of 8 children in a working-class family. Several of his older brothers boxed before him, which is part of how he ended up in gyms as a kid in the first place, tagging along, picking up habits long before anyone thought he'd become the one carrying the family name into world title fights. He turned professional at 15 years old, fighting on small regional cards in Mexico, while most kids his age were still in school, sometimes weighing in under fake paperwork just to be allowed in the ring at that age. By his early 20s, he had already built a fan base most boxers spend a lifetime chasing, largely because Mexican audiences saw something in him that went beyond just being good with his hands. He fought often, he fought aggressively, and he did it with the kind of red hair and freckled face that made him stand out instantly in a sport dominated by a certain look. Canelo means cinnamon in Spanish, and the nickname stuck because it made him unmistakable, a label that started as a schoolyard tease about his complexion and ended up branded across arenas worldwide. By 2011, he had already claimed his first world title at just 20 years old. And from there, his career became less about climbing the ladder and more about deciding which legends he wanted to face next. He fought Floyd Mayweather in 2013, the biggest payday of his young career at that point. And even though he lost a lopsided decision, the fight made him a global name and taught him, by his own admission, lessons about pacing and patience that he carried into every fight afterward. He went on to face Gennady Golovkin in one of the most talked-about rivalries boxing has seen in the last 2 decades. 2 fights, a draw and a narrow decision win, that pushed pay-per-view numbers most fighters never get close to and turned a rivalry into something closer to a soap opera, with both camps trading accusations for years. By the time he secured the undisputed super middleweight championship, becoming the first male boxer in the four-belt era to hold every major title in a single division, Canelo wasn't just a champion. He was the financial engine keeping an entire sport alive. The one name that could move a pay-per-view number on reputation alone. The one fighter whose calendar networks built their entire boxing schedule around. Outside the ring, his persona only added to his pull. He was known for being guarded with media, careful with his words, rarely the type to trash talk the way some of his rivals did. That restraint, paired with his ferocity in the ring, became part of the appeal. Mexican fans in particular embraced him not just as a champion, but as a symbol, the inheritor of a boxing tradition that runs through legends like Julio Cesar Chavez Sr., a name that carries enormous weight in Mexican sports history. Being handed that torch came with expectations most athletes never have to deal with, including the expectation that he represent the country well in everything he does outside the ring, not just inside it. Now, while all of this was happening in the ring, something else was building in the background. Canelo started expanding outside boxing, and not in the way most athletes do with a sneaker deal or a clothing capsule here and there. He built an actual business empire. He launched his own boxing promotion company, giving him control over his own future fights and a stake in the sport's business side rather than just being an employee of it. He started a tequila-based canned cocktail brand, riding the wave of celebrity-backed spirits that's become its own industry in recent years. He put his name on a clothing line. And maybe most relevant to where this story is headed, he expanded into the energy and retail sector in Mexico, building out a chain of gas stations and convenience stores under the name Upper by Canelo Energy, a venture that put his brand directly into the everyday lives of millions of Mexicans who might never watch a single one of his fights, but would still drive past his name on a storefront every day. This is the part that matters, because when you become the biggest athlete in a country, when your name becomes valuable enough to put on gas stations and liquor brands and entire business ventures, you stop being just a person. You become a brand that other people want to attach themselves to. Investors want in. Local business figures want photos with you. People with money and connections start showing up at your fights, your events, your circles. And the bigger that orbit gets, the harder it becomes to vet every single person standing inside it. That's not a flaw unique to Canelo. That's just what happens to anyone who becomes this big, this fast, in a country where business, politics, and organized crime have historically overlapped in ways that are well documented and not exactly subtle. The more storefronts you put your name on, the more middlemen, suppliers, and local partners you inevitably need. And every one of those relationships is a potential point of exposure that has nothing to do with whether you personally did anything wrong. So with that context in place, let's get into what actually happened in 2025, because this is where the headline started. In July of 2025, Mexican media outlets began reporting on a businessman named Eric Daniel Zamora Delgadillo. According to those reports, Delgadillo was under investigation in the United States for allegedly laundering money on behalf of the cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, commonly known as Chung. To understand why that name alone made the story explode, you have to understand what Chung actually is. This isn't some minor regional gang. It emerged out of the wreckage of older cartels in the late 2000s and announced itself to the country in 2011 by displaying the bodies of dozens of rival members in Veracruz. A calculated act of violence meant to send a message about who was taking over. Within a few years, it had split from the Sinaloa cartel, the organization once led by Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, and gone to war with practically every major criminal group in the country to carve out its own territory. Today, security analysts consider CIJING one of the two most powerful criminal organizations in Mexico, alongside Sinaloa, with operations reported in the majority of Mexico's states and assets estimated in the billions of dollars. Its leader, a man known by the alias El Mencho, has been the subject of one of the largest bounties the U.S. government has ever placed on a single fugitive. This is the organization Delgadillo was reportedly accused of laundering money for, which tells you immediately why a regional business story turned into a story with international weight attached to it. Delgadillo was also reportedly under scrutiny in Mexico for alleged ties to a fuel theft network, something locally referred to as huachicoleo, where stolen or illegally diverted fuel gets funneled through legitimate-looking businesses and sold on the black market. Fuel theft might sound like a smaller crime compared to drug trafficking, but in Mexico it's become one of the largest illicit industries in the country, generating billions of dollars a year and drawing in cartels precisely because it offers a way to generate enormous cash flow through businesses that look completely ordinary from the outside. Gas stations, convenience stores, fuel suppliers, the exact kind of infrastructure that doesn't raise red flags the way a drug shipment would. Here's where it connects back to Canelo. According to the reporting, Delgadillo's company, a fuel supplier called Eco Carburante, allegedly sold stolen fuel that made its way through Upper by Canelo Energy, the convenience store and gas station chain carrying Canelo's name and backing. Now, did Canelo personally arrange this? Is there any evidence he knew about it? Based on what's been publicly reported, no. There's no indication he was personally involved or aware of any alleged wrongdoing. But his name, his brand, and his business were reportedly part of the supply chain these allegations describe. And that's exactly the kind of detail that turns a regional business story into international headlines. But the story doesn't stop with the fuel allegations. According to the reports, before Delgadillo led Eco Carburante, he had previously served as president of a company called Agricola Boreal, a business that had already been blacklisted by the United States Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control for suspected involvement in drug trafficking and financial crimes. That's not a small detail. Being placed on that kind of list isn't a casual accusation. It's the result of U.S. federal investigators determining there was enough evidence to formally sanction a company, freezing its access to the American financial system entirely. So by the time Delgadillo entered Canelo's business orbit, he reportedly already had a documented history connecting him to organizations under federal scrutiny, a history that, if accurate, existed well before any reported involvement with Canelo's brand. And then there's a third layer to this. Delgadillo was reportedly associated with a man named Jose Isabel Murguia Santiago, who goes by the nickname El Choco. According to the reporting, Murguia is the brother of Jose Ascension Murguia, the former mayor of Tochetlan, a municipality that became infamous earlier in 2025 after Mexican authorities discovered what's been described as a training and execution
whether
site
through startups in Latin
allegedly
America
used
or
by the
silent
Jalisco
partnerships
cartel,
in international companies,
located at a
it's
ranch
possible
in
that a
same
portion of
area.
that Crawford purse
A
was allocated
discovery
into
that drew
assets
global
far less
media
flashy than
attention
Bugattis,
and
but
was
potentially
described by
far
some
more
investigators
profitable.
as
Then
one of
there's
the most
family wealth
disturbing
planning.
sites
Canelo has 4
uncovered
children,
in the
and
country's
like many
cartel
disciplined
conflict
millionaires,
in
he's thought
recent
ahead,
memory.
setting up trusts, diversified
The
investment
former mayor
accounts,
was
and
reportedly
long-term funds
arrested in
ensures that
connection
his
to
kids
crimes
inherit not
linked
just
to
money,
that
but
property.
generational wealth. This is
And
the
according
side
to
of Canelo
multiple
fans
reports,
rarely see.
Jose
It doesn't come with
Isabel
Instagram
Murguia,
posts
the
or
brother,
luxury
had been
showcases,
seen
but it
attending
reflects the real
Canelo's fights
financial
in the
intelligence
United
of a man
States.
who's made hundreds of millions
Now I want
and
to
doesn't
pause
plan
here
to lose it.
and be
What
very
makes this
clear
twist
about
asset
what we
so
actually
compelling
know
is that it reflects
versus
two
what's
sides of
being
Canelo,
implied.
the
Attending
superstar who
someone's
buys
boxing
Bugattis
match is
and the
not
strategist
evidence of a
who buys
business
farmland,
relationship,
the fighter
let
who
alone
shows off his
criminal
Richard Mille,
involvement.
and the father who quietly
Powerful and
secures
wealthy
his
people
children's
show up at
futures.
Canelo
That
fights
balance is what
constantly.
separates
It's
broke
one of the
athletes from
biggest
legends
trends
who
in
build
global
dynasties,
sports.
but the real question
attendance
remains,
alone
when the dust
proves
settled on
nothing.
that $150 million
But when you
fight
stack these
purse, where
details
did
together,
every dollar
an
actually
associate
go? That's where
allegedly
the final
laundering
breakdown
cartel
reveals the
money,
truth. Here's
a
the raw
prior
reality
company
of fight purses.
blacklisted by
Canelo
the US
Alvarez
Treasury,
earned
and a
$150
connection to a
million
family tied
against
to a
Terrence
property
Crawford in
linked to one of the most
2025. But
disturbing
by the time
organized
everyone
crime
takes their cut,
discoveries
the
in
number
Mexico
looks
that
very
year.
different.
You
First,
start to
taxes.
understand why
Between
this story
US federal,
didn't just stay a
state,
regional
and Mexican
business footnote.
obligations, as
It
much as
became a
40%
national
is gone.
conversation.
That's
It's also
$60
worth
million
mentioning the timing,
off the top. Next
because
are trainers,
this is the detail
managers,
that turned
and
the
his camp.
story from
A
a
fighter's
regional
team typically
headline
claims
into
10 to
something
15%.
boxing fans
That
everywhere were suddenly discussing. This story broke just days after another high-profile Mexican boxer, Julio Cesar Chavez Jr., son of the legendary Julio Cesar Chavez Sr., was arrested and ultimately deported following his loss to Jake Paul, reportedly due to suspected ties to the Sinaloa cartel. Chavez Jr.'s situation was, on its face, a completely separate matter, involving a different fighter, a different cartel, and a different set of allegations entirely. But within the same news cycle, two of Mexico's most recognizable boxing names, one of them carrying the literal surname of the sport's greatest Mexican legend, were suddenly being mentioned alongside cartel-related investigations. That's the kind of coincidence that makes a story spread fast, whether or not the two situations actually had anything to do with each other. And it's exactly the kind of coincidence that got turned into commentary across boxing forums and social media, with people drawing a straight line between the two stories that the facts themselves don't actually support. As of the reporting available, Canelo and his representatives have not made any detailed public statement addressing the Delgadillo allegations directly. That silence gets interpreted differently depending on who you ask. Some people see it as standard legal caution, the kind of no-comment response any lawyer would advise when your name gets pulled into someone else's federal investigation, especially when that investigation is still active and any public statement could complicate it further. Others see the silence itself as suspicious, even though staying quiet during an active investigation is one of the most common and legally sound responses there is. The same advice any attorney would give a public figure in this position, regardless of guilt or innocence. Either way, the lack of a detailed response left a vacuum, and the internet does not like vacuums. It fills them, usually within hours. So that's the business side of the story. But to really understand why people were primed to connect dots the way they did, we have to go back to 2018, to a story that had nothing to do with cartels, money laundering, or business associates at all. But that resurfaced anyway the moment this new controversy broke. In December of 2018, just days before Canelo was set to fight Rocky Fielding in New York for the UBA super middleweight title, his brother was kidnapped in Mexico. Canelo didn't make this public at the time. He kept it private, handled it himself, while simultaneously preparing for one of the biggest fights of that stretch of his career, doing media obligations, training camp, and weight cuts as if nothing was wrong, putting on the calm, confident face the public expects from a champion days before a title defense. He revealed the full story years later, in 2021, during an interview with Graham Bensinger, choosing at one point to switch from English to Spanish so a translator could relay his words, as if the story itself needed to be told in the language it happened in. According to what he described, the kidnapping happened on a Monday, with the fight scheduled for that Saturday, giving him less than a week to resolve a crisis most people would need months to process. For 3 days, Canelo personally negotiated his brother's release over the phone, all while doing media appearances and training, with almost no one around him aware of what was actually happening behind the scenes. He explained that he didn't even communicate directly with the kidnappers himself, instead relaying messages back and forth through his cousin, who would deliver his words to the kidnappers and report their responses back to him. An arrangement that meant every single word of that negotiation passed through an intermediary, while Canelo sat somewhere preparing to defend a world title in front of millions of viewers. He explained that he chose not to involve Mexican police because he was afraid some officers might have been connected to the kidnappers themselves, a fear that says a lot about the environment he was operating in, separate from anything related to this current controversy, and a fear that's been echoed by other wealthy families in Mexico who faced similar situations and made the same calculation. In the end, his brother was released. Canelo went on to fight Fielding that Saturday and won by knockout in the third round, dropping him 4 times along the way, all while carrying something most of the public and most of the media asking him questions that week had no idea about. When he told this story in 2021, it was framed almost entirely as a story about mental toughness, about performing at an elite level while privately handling one of the most stressful situations imaginable. The kind of story that gets replayed in highlight reels about athletes who compete through adversity. He even reflected, during that same interview, on how badly he wanted to move his family out of Mexico altogether, but admitted it wasn't something he could bring himself to do because their entire lives, their routines, their community existed there. A tension between fame's rewards and its risks that he's never fully resolved. For years, that's exactly how the story stayed. A footnote about resilience rather than a thread in any larger narrative. But once the 2025 Business Associate story broke, people started going back and rereading the kidnapping story through a completely different lens. Suddenly, it wasn't just a story about resilience. It became, for some, supposed evidence of a deeper pattern, proof that Canelo's world had always existed close to this kind of danger, and that the new allegations were simply the latest chapter in something that had been there all along. Is that a fair connection to make? Not really, and it's important to say that clearly. A kidnapping where Canelo and his family were the victims, targeted specifically because of his wealth and fame, is a fundamentally different situation than allegations involving a business associate's financial dealings years later. One is a story about Canelo being preyed upon. The other is a story about who he was doing business with. But online, nuance like that often gets flattened. 2 stories involving the same person and the same general world of organized crime in Mexico get treated as if they're part of one continuous narrative, even when the actual relationship between them is, at best, circumstantial. And that brings us to the bigger question underneath all of this. Why does boxing, specifically, keep getting pulled into these conversations? Part of the answer is structural. Boxing has a long, well-documented history of intersecting with organized crime, going back decades, in multiple countries, not just Mexico. In the United States, mob influence over boxing promotion and gambling in the mid-20th century is practically its own chapter of crime history, with congressional hearings and federal investigations into fixed fights and mob-controlled promoters. Promoters, sponsors, and even fighters have been linked to criminal organizations at various points throughout the sport's history, largely because boxing generates enormous amounts of cash, operates across borders, and has historically had less centralized regulation than other major sports like football or basketball, which operate under single governing bodies with strict financial oversight. Where there's that much money moving with that little oversight, in cash-heavy businesses like ticket sales, sponsorships, and pay-per-view revenue, it becomes a target for people looking to clean illegal funds through seemingly legitimate channels. Part of the answer is also specific to Mexico. Cartels in Mexico aren't confined to drug trafficking anymore, if they ever were. Investigators and journalists have documented their fingers in everything from avocado exports to fuel distribution to local political offices, even municipal governments in some regions. Researchers who study organized crime in Mexico describe a model where cartels don't just traffic narcotics, They effectively govern and tax entire local economies, embedding themselves into legitimate commerce so deeply that separating clean business from cartel-adjacent business becomes nearly impossible in certain regions and certain industries. Given that level of penetration into ordinary commerce, the genuinely surprising outcome would be if Mexico's most famous and wealthiest athlete never crossed paths, even indirectly, with someone connected to that world. That's not an excuse for what was allegedly happening. It's just the reality of doing business at scale in that environment, particularly in a state like Jalisco, which happens to be both Canelo's home state and the namesake and home base of CJing itself. And part of the answer is simply about fame itself. The bigger a public figure becomes, the more their associates, their family members, their business partners, and even people who just show up at their events become part of the story whether the figure wants that or not. This isn't unique to Canelo. We've seen similar guilt by association narratives attach themselves to athletes, musicians, and business figures across the world, where one connection, even a loose one, gets treated as a window into the person's entire character. A famous musician photographed with the wrong person at an after-party. A tech billionaire whose investment fund once took money from a controversial source. A politician whose distant cousin turns out to have a criminal record. These patterns repeat constantly across completely different industries because the underlying mechanism is the same. Fame creates proximity, proximity gets photographed, and photographs get reinterpreted endlessly once a controversy needs supporting evidence. Sometimes that scrutiny uncovers something real and leads to actual accountability. Often it just generates headlines and speculation that never actually go anywhere, fading out the moment a new story takes its place in the cycle. Online, this kind of story tends to follow a predictable pattern, almost like a script of its own. First comes the initial report, usually from a regional outlet, often in Spanish-language media, before it crosses over into English coverage through aggregator sites and sports blogs looking for traffic. Then come the social media threads, where people start laying out every name, every company, every prior controversy in a long chain, designed to look like a connected timeline, even when some of those connections are thin at best, stitched together with phrases like coincidence, and connect the dots that do a lot of persuasive work without actually providing evidence. Then come the comparisons to other recent boxing controversies, like the Chavez Jr. situation, which gets cited constantly, not because the two cases are actually related, but because the timing makes the comparison irresistible, and because two simultaneous stories feel like a pattern even when they're really just two unrelated events that happen to land in the same week. Forums and comment sections fill with half-joking, half-serious speculation, the kind of dark humor that's become its own genre of internet commentary around organized crime in Mexico. Jokes about cartels funding everything from avocados to boxing that get repeated so often they start to feel like established fact, even when they're closer to gallows humor. And then, eventually, the story either gets a follow-up with actual legal developments, or it quietly fades as the news cycle moves on to something else, often without any real resolution either way, leaving behind only the residue of suspicion that doesn't fully go away even after the headlines stop. That pattern is worth understanding, because it explains why so many of these stories feel unfinished. The Delgadillo investigation may still be ongoing as far as public information shows. There's been no confirmed legal action specifically naming Canelo, no charges, no formal allegation that he personally participated in anything illegal. What exists right now is a set of reported connections, a documented history involving the people in his business orbit, and a public left to decide for itself how much weight to give any of it, often without the patience or the access to actually find out how the story ends. So where does that leave us? Canelo Alvarez remains, by almost every measure, one of the most successful athletes alive, with a business empire that extends well beyond boxing and a level of cultural influence in Mexico that very few public figures ever achieve. The reports about his business associates' alleged ties to cartel-related financial activity are serious, and they deserve continued scrutiny, especially given the documented history of the people involved. But serious reports about an associate are not the same thing as proof about Canelo himself, and right now, that distinction matters more than the headlines sometimes suggest. The kidnapping of his brother in 2018 remains its own story, a genuinely harrowing experience that speaks to the dangers wealthy and famous families face in parts of Mexico, regardless of who they choose to do business with. Folding it into this new controversy might make for a more dramatic narrative, but it doesn't actually add evidence to either story. It just makes both of them feel bigger than they currently are, the same way any two dramatic headlines about the same person start to feel connected purely because they share a name, even when the actual causal thread between them doesn't exist. It's worth sitting with what this kind of story does to a public figure's image, separate from whatever the legal outcome eventually turns out to be. Reputation in the social media era doesn't wait for due process. A headline gets read by millions of people in the time it takes an investigation to barely begin. And by the time any follow-up reporting clarifies, confirms, or walks back the original claims, most of that audience has already moved on, carrying whatever impression that first headline left behind. For someone like Canelo, whose entire brand outside the ring is built on trust, the trust of fans buying his cocktails, filling up at his gas stations, watching his fights on pay-per-view, that kind of lingering impression can matter just as much as anything a court eventually decides, regardless of where the facts ultimately land. What this really comes down to is a pattern we see again and again with public figures who reach this level of fame and wealth. The bigger you get, the more people attach themselves to your name, your brand, your events, sometimes for reasons that have nothing to do with you personally. Some of those people will turn out to be exactly who they appear to be. Others, it turns out, bring histories you never agreed to inherit. The challenge, for someone in Canelo's position, isn't necessarily about doing anything wrong. It's about controlling an orbit that, by definition, gets harder to control the bigger it grows, especially in an economy and a region where the line between legitimate enterprise and organized crime has been blurred for longer than Canelo has been alive. Whether more details come out about the Delgadillo investigation, whether any of it eventually connects back to Canelo in a way that goes beyond association, or whether this becomes another story that fades without a clear resolution, is something only time is going to answer. The honest version of this story, the one without the dramatic music and the ominous narration, is messier and less satisfying than the version the internet wants to tell. It's a story about proximity, about the unavoidable risks of building an empire in a country where crime touches nearly every layer of the economy, and about how quickly speculation can outrun evidence once two unrelated stories start sharing the same headline space. But one thing is certain: as long as Canelo Alvarez remains the biggest name in boxing, every person who enters his orbit is going to come under the same kind of scrutiny he does. And in a country where the line between business and organized crime has never been as clean as anyone would like, that scrutiny isn't going away anytime soon.